A presidential residence swallowed by fire. South Africa's leader targeted in what investigators are now calling a deliberate act of arson. A security breach that was supposed to be impossible has just happened, and the consequences stretch far beyond a single night of chaos. We are breaking down the full timeline, the security failures that made this possible, the political figures who could benefit, and the constitutional crisis that was narrowly avoided. From forensic evidence to suspect profiles, from economic shockwaves to international reactions, this is the complete story behind the headlines that stunned the entire nation. Before we go any further, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Should presidential security protocols be made public so citizens can hold authorities accountable, or should they stay classified to prevent dangerous exploitation? Your opinion matters, and we want to hear it. The emergency call came in at exactly 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would permanently reshape South Africa's political landscape. Flames were already visible from the eastern wing of the presidential residence in Cape Town, and within minutes, the full national security apparatus was activated. At first, officials suspected an electrical malfunction. But that explanation collapsed almost immediately. Accelerant patterns identified by the first fire marshal on scene revealed deliberate ignition at 3 separate points. This was not an accident. This was a coordinated attack. The method used suggested insider-level knowledge. Whoever started the fire appeared to understand the building's internal layout, security schedules, and even the blind spots in surveillance systems. By 3:15 a.m., President Cyril Ramaphosa had been evacuated to a secure undisclosed location, and a formal criminal investigation was launched. The rapid response likely prevented a national disaster, but the deeper issue was now unavoidable. If this could happen here, nowhere at the highest level of government was truly safe. The Eastern Wing was not just any part of the residence. It contained the president's private study, a conference room used for sensitive national security meetings, and a secure communications hub. Investigators later confirmed that the private study suffered the most severe damage. Flames destroyed historical documents, personal correspondence, and multiple electronic devices that may have stored classified material. The communications center, designed to withstand extreme conditions, remained mostly intact, though smoke damage rendered several systems temporarily unusable. What alarmed security analysts most was the precision of the attack. This was not random vandalism or symbolic destruction. The fire was directed at areas where confidential information was gathered, processed, and stored. Early estimates placed the physical damage at millions of rand. But the true cost was harder to measure. While backup servers preserved most digital data, the breach itself exposed a vulnerability that should never have existed in the first place. The first fire crew arrived just 7 minutes after the alarm was triggered and encountered an active blaze that had already spread through 2 rooms. Captain Thiamthemu, who led the response, later described the fire as unusually intense, requiring foam suppression alongside standard water methods. His team operated carefully, aware that they were not only fighting a fire, but also preserving a crime scene. By 4:20 a.m., the flames were finally under control, but the real investigation had only just begun. Firefighters quickly identified multiple points of origin, a classic indicator of arson that ruled out any possibility of an accident. As the investigation deepened, another critical detail emerged. One of the security cameras had been disabled roughly 30 minutes before the fire started. This was not a technical malfunction. It was physically tampered with. Someone had deliberately taken it offline. The level of coordination behind the operation made it clear this was not the work of a single angry individual acting on impulse. Presidential security is built in layers: physical barriers, trained personnel, electronic surveillance, and rapid response systems designed to overlap and compensate for each other. Yet somewhere inside that network, several failures aligned at the same time. The outer perimeter showed no signs of forced entry, which suggested the person responsible either had legitimate access or exploited a known weakness, possibly during a routine shift change. Security logs recorded no unauthorized entries at all. That detail was deeply unsettling because it meant the list of suspects narrowed to people who already had clearance. The disabled camera created a blind spot that lasted exactly 18 minutes, more than enough time to place accelerants and activate ignition devices. What disturbed analysts the most was the timing itself. The attack took place during a scheduled maintenance window, when certain backup systems were temporarily offline for routine updates. That kind of operational precision pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of internal security schedules, raising serious concerns about vetting processes and the ongoing monitoring of staff with access to restricted areas. Political violence in South Africa is never just a single incident. It carries meaning far beyond the immediate act. At the time of the fire, Ramaphosa was already facing intense pressure from different factions inside his own party. The timing instantly triggered speculation about internal power struggles within the African National Congress. Some analysts linked the attack to his recent anti-corruption campaigns, which had angered influential figures. Others focused on his economic reforms, which threatened long-standing financial interests. The fire erupted only weeks before a critical party conference where leadership roles were up for contest, and in that climate, conspiracy theories spread rapidly. Opposition leaders avoided making direct accusations but were quick to spotlight the security collapse. The Democratic Alliance demanded an independent investigation. The economic freedom fighters questioned whether the incident had been staged to generate political sympathy. Smaller parties called for transparency, while accusing the government of withholding key information from the public. The African National Congress has ruled South Africa since 1994, but internal divisions have grown sharper in recent years. Ramaphosa represents a reformist faction focused on dismantling corruption networks that have damaged the party's credibility. Opposing him is a more traditionalist bloc that views these reforms as a betrayal of liberation-era values. The fire occurred as these tensions reached a breaking point, especially around policies like cadre deployment and the pace of economic transformation. Political analysts noted that attacks on national leaders often precede major shifts inside ruling parties, opening space for ambitious figures waiting to rise. Whether this fire was directly linked to internal ANC battles remains unproven. But one question refused to go away. Who stands to gain from weakening or destabilizing Ramaphosa's presidency? Party insiders, speaking anonymously, described factions that see the current president as too friendly toward business elites and too aggressive in prosecuting fellow party members accused of enriching themselves through state capture. The Democratic Alliance moved quickly, shaping the narrative within hours and presenting the incident as clear evidence of systemic security failures under ANC rule. Their parliamentary leader publicly demanded the resignation of the Minister of Police and called for an international security audit of all major government facilities. The economic freedom fighters took a very different stance. Julius Malema suggested during a press briefing that the timing of the fire seemed almost too convenient, implying it may have been engineered to generate public sympathy ahead of looming political confrontations. Smaller opposition parties echoed both arguments, creating a wave of competing accusations that drowned out appeals to wait for the investigation to reach its conclusions. Social media turned into a digital war zone where conspiracy theories spread faster than fact-checkers could contain them. Some claim the fire was orchestrated by Ramaphosa's own inner circle as a pretext to justify a political crackdown. Others insisted it was an attempted assassination linked to factions loyal to his predecessor, Jacob Zuma, who still retained strong grassroots support despite facing serious corruption allegations. South African presidents have faced threats before, though rarely inside their official residences. Nelson Mandela survived several assassination plots during his presidency, including one involving right-wing extremists planning to bomb his motorcade. Thabo Mbeki faced credible threats from groups angered by his HIV and AIDS policies, although none escalated into direct attacks on his property or personal safety. Jacob Zuma's time in office was marked by frequent protests that sometimes turned violent, but his greatest danger came from legal pressure rather than physical harm. What made this fire truly unprecedented was where it happened. It occurred inside what was supposed to be one of the most secure spaces in the country. A breach that confirmed the worst fears of security strategists. History shows that attacks on national leaders often mirror deeper social tensions, economic inequality, ethnic divisions, or ideological conflicts that erupt when institutional systems fail to absorb public frustration. The Presidential Protection Service operates under the South African Police Service but functions as a specialized unit with advanced training and equipment. Officers undergo psychological evaluations, tactical training, and continuous vetting to maintain high-level security clearance. Yet despite these safeguards, the fire exposed weaknesses that experts had warned about for years. Budget limitations had delayed critical surveillance upgrades, leaving sections of the residence monitored by outdated cameras with poor night vision. Staff shortages forced longer shifts, increasing fatigue and reducing alertness among protection officers. Most alarming of all was the discovery that background checks for maintenance and support staff had not been updated in more than 3 years. Contractors and service providers with routine access to secure zones had effectively slipped through outdated screening systems. The entire protection strategy had relied on the belief that physical barriers and human awareness could make up for technological gaps. The fire proved that assumption was not just flawed, but dangerously optimistic. If this analysis is giving you real value and you want to stay updated as this investigation continues to unfold, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. We are following this story in real time, breaking down the political consequences and cutting through the noise to bring you verified information as it emerges. Forensic investigators arrived the moment the fire was fully extinguished, treating the residence like a high-level crime laboratory. They documented accelerant splash patterns showing that gasoline or a similar petroleum-based fuel had been poured in deliberate trails linking the 3 ignition points. Chemical testing confirmed the presence of a commercial-grade accelerant mixed with a binding agent, allowing it to cling to vertical surfaces. This indicated technical knowledge of arson far beyond amateur behavior. Timing devices recovered from 2 locations were identified as simple mechanical igniters, the kind available through industrial suppliers. They required no advanced electronics and left no digital trail that could be traced through purchase records. What disturbed investigators most was what they did not find. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, and no biological traces at any of the entry points or ignition sites. That level of cleanliness suggested either professional training or extremely careful planning by someone familiar with forensic countermeasures. The investigation quickly expanded into financial records, searching for unusual transactions that might connect suspects to materials or equipment used in the attack. Within 48 hours, police had detained 3 individuals for questioning, although no official arrests were announced. The first was a maintenance contractor who had worked on the Eastern Wing's electrical systems 2 weeks before the fire. Access logs showed he spent time near the areas where the fire started, and investigators discovered he had previously been dismissed from a government contract due to security-related violations. The second person of interest was a junior security officer who had called in sick on the night of the fire, breaking a flawless attendance record stretching back 18 months. Phone records revealed several calls to an unlisted number in the hours leading up to the incident. He initially denied making the calls before later admitting they were personal. The third individual was a political operative linked to an ANC faction opposed to Ramaphosa's leadership. He did not have direct access to the presidential residence, but surveillance footage placed him meeting with the maintenance contractor at a Johannesburg cafe 3 days before the fire. None of the 3 matched the profile of a lone attacker, reinforcing the theory of a coordinated operation that authorities were still trying to fully map. At the same time, social media erupted into a crisis of its own. Hashtags demanding transparency trended alongside conspiracy theories ranging from credible to completely absurd. Some users circulated unverified images claiming to identify suspects or reveal evidence, forcing police to warn against misinformation and vigilante behavior. Fact-checking organizations worked non-stop to debunk false claims, including a viral video said to show the fire that was actually footage from a commercial building blaze in Pretoria back in 2019. The speed at which false narratives spread created a second emergency for authorities already struggling to manage public perception. Verified facts became hard to separate from speculation, and legitimate concerns about security failures were buried under waves of partisan accusations and unfounded theories. The resulting information chaos benefited no one except those who thrived on confusion and public distrust. Financial markets reacted with immediate nervousness. The rand fell by 2% against the dollar in early trading, reflecting investor anxiety over political stability. Foreign institutional investors, already cautious about South Africa's economic direction, viewed the incident as further proof of governance risks that could impact long-term investments. Bond yields rose as risk premiums adjusted to the new uncertainty. Economic analysts noted that while the immediate market reaction was relatively modest, prolonged instability could seriously undermine foreign direct investment at a time when South Africa urgently needed capital to address unemployment and infrastructure shortfalls. Business confidence, already fragile, declined even further in surveys conducted during the week following the fire. The economic ripple effects of the attack quickly spread beyond financial markets into real-world consequences. Companies began reassessing their internal security protocols, senior executives postponed planned visits, and international partners quietly questioned whether South Africa could truly guarantee the safety of high-level delegations and long-term investments. What started as a political shock was now becoming a practical risk calculation for businesses operating in the country. Constitutional scholars immediately began exploring scenarios that few had seriously considered before. If the attack had succeeded in its apparent objective of injuring or killing the president, South Africa would have faced its first presidential assassination in the democratic era. The Constitution does outline clear succession rules, with the deputy president automatically stepping in. But the political vacuum created by a violent transfer of power would have been entirely unprecedented. Experts raised urgent questions. Could Parliament function under direct threat? Would emergency powers be declared? How would national elections be conducted in a climate of fear and instability? These issues had always existed in theory, but the fire made them feel dangerously real. Some legal analysts warned that a successful attack could have justified authoritarian measures in the name of national security, potentially eroding the very democratic freedoms that define post-apartheid South Africa. In that sense, the fire became a stress test for constitutional resilience. It revealed not only the strength of institutional frameworks, but also how fragile long-term stability really was. It forced uncomfortable debates about where the line should be drawn between necessary security and the preservation of an open democratic society. How much protection is too much before it begins to undermine the freedoms it claims to defend? International reactions followed almost immediately. The United States Embassy issued a statement condemning the attack and offered technical assistance in the investigation, including access to FBI forensic specialists in arson and domestic terrorism. The United Kingdom's Foreign Office expressed solidarity while carefully avoiding any implication that South Africa was incapable of handling its own security. The African Union released a statement emphasizing the importance of democratic stability across the continent and offered support through its peace and security mechanisms. Regional neighbors including Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe reached out through diplomatic channels, fully aware that instability in Africa's most industrialized economy would ripple across the entire southern region. Privately, some international observers voiced concerns that South Africa was beginning to show signs of the political violence that had destabilized other African nations in past decades. The attack became a test of whether South Africa's institutions were strong enough to withstand targeted violence without falling into cycles of retaliation that had scarred other young democracies. Ramaphosa's first public statement came 36 hours after the fire. The delay was quickly seized upon by critics as a sign of weakness or internal confusion. When he finally addressed the nation, his tone was calm and controlled. He acknowledged the seriousness of the attack, thanked emergency responders, and assured citizens that government continuity had never been in question. He promised that those responsible would face the full force of the law. What stood out just as much was what he did not say. There were no accusations, no references to political motives, and no requests for emergency powers. Analysts noted that this restraint could be read as statesmanship or as a leader navigating uncertainty about who was truly behind the attack. His framing of the incident as an attack on democracy itself, rather than on him personally, appeared carefully chosen to lift the issue above party politics. Whether that narrative would hold remained uncertain. The most striking moment of his speech came when he openly acknowledged security failures without shifting blame. For a sitting president, this was rare. It suggested either genuine accountability or a calculated move to get ahead of inevitable criticism. The next phase of the investigation will determine whether formal charges are laid and against whom. Legal experts believe this process could take months, given the complexity of the evidence and the political sensitivity surrounding the case. Meanwhile, security reforms are already in motion. The Presidential Protection Service has begun immediate upgrades to surveillance systems, tightened access controls, and revised vetting procedures. A broader review of security across all government facilities has also been launched, led by an independent panel that includes international experts in counterterrorism and infrastructure protection. Parliamentary oversight committees have scheduled hearings to investigate how the breach occurred and what systemic reforms are necessary to prevent it from happening again. The political consequences are expected to last well into the next election cycle. Opposition parties are using the incident to question the ANC's competence, while the ruling party is trying to frame it as an attack on democracy itself rather than a failure of governance. Civil society groups are now demanding greater transparency, arguing that public trust cannot be restored without more openness than authorities have so far been willing to provide. The tension between operational security and democratic accountability is now shaping how this entire story unfolds. This incident forces uncomfortable questions about how democracies protect their leaders without drifting into the same authoritarian practices that threaten freedom. Security can always be strengthened, access can always be restricted, surveillance can always be expanded, but every additional layer of protection comes at a cost. That cost is transparency, openness, and public trust. South Africa now stands at a crossroads that will reveal what kind of democracy it truly wants to be. One path accepts a certain level of risk as the price of remaining open and accessible. The other prioritizes security above all else, even if that creates a growing distance between leaders and the people they are meant to serve. The fire at Ramaphosa's residence was not just an attack on a building or even on a president. It was a challenge to the democratic contract that holds the country together. How the nation responds, how thoroughly the investigation is pursued, how transparent the process remains, and how carefully the balance between freedom and security is managed will set precedents that reach far beyond this single event. Other democracies facing similar threats are watching closely, looking to see whether South Africa can protect its leadership without sacrificing the institutions that make democracy meaningful in the first place. As the smoke clears and forensic teams begin to scale back their presence, the burned Eastern Wing remains a silent reminder of how close the country came to a far greater crisis. Internal investigations continue behind closed doors. Political maneuvering grows more intense, and the public waits for answers that may never feel fully complete. The real measure of a nation is not the absence of threats, but how it responds when those threats become real. South Africa's story is still unfolding, and this chapter, written in fire and uncertainty, is shaping everything that comes next. The world remains focused on Cape Town, waiting for clarity to emerge from the ashes, while the investigation moves forward and the deeper consequences of that night continue to surface.